Well, hello everybody. Pastor Joel here with you one more time for the past days with Pastor Joel. Hey, we're up to 118 subscribers, which is really exciting, and I'm going to start having a little bit of fun with this. So when we get to 125 subscribers, that's only 7 away, right? If you are that subscriber, I'd like you to leave a comment on one of my videos and just say I'm subscriber 125, or you can find me on Facebook and let me know what you would like me to do a video on. It could have something to do with fulfilled eschatology. It could be even another biblical topic. Just let me know what kind of video you would like me to do, and give me maybe just a couple bullet points on what you're looking for, what you'd like to see, and I will do it. A couple other housekeeping things. Several of you have asked if there's a way to support the channel. I'm not making that up. People really have. So I'm working on a Patreon account. I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed at all when it comes to technology, but I'm working on doing that, and also have some really exciting things to announce as we move forward in this. You might notice I have a hat on. I don't know if you can read that well. It says the Burrows of Berea podcast. The Burrows of Berea podcast. One of the things I want to do with my channel, as well as get my own content out to you, is let you know where you can find other great content. And if you are not familiar with the Burrows of Berea podcast, why not? You really should be. It's a really unique podcast in terms of the crew that puts it on, and basically they talk about the Bible from a number of different perspectives. They're not afraid to ask the hard questions. They're not afraid to deal with difficult topics. And it just so happens that a couple of the people involved with that podcast have fairly recently come to some very similar conclusions with eschatology. So they've also interviewed some folks on that podcast. You may know some of these names. They've interviewed Mike Sullivan, I believe Michael Miano, Glenn Hill, Don Preston, John Noe, Bob Cruikshank, and others. They also have some great roundtable discussions. And yours truly had this wonderful opportunity to be interviewed by Burrows of Berea. That podcast is going to drop next Thursday, August 3rd. Next Thursday, August 3rd. So you might check that out, hear a little bit of my testimony. Let me also encourage you, today they're dropping a podcast with Dr. Amy Castillo. I think I've got her last name correct. And she also did an interview in that same weekend, and I got to meet her, and her testimony is absolutely amazing. Now, she has come to similar conclusions again with eschatology, but there's so much more to it than that, and I would really encourage you to do that. So look for Burrows of Berea, and you can scroll through and find some of those interviews I mentioned, and a lot of other great content as well. What I'm going to do in this video is kind of a continuation where I've been looking at some articles that are written against preterism to disprove preterism, and just looking at some of the points in them. And so this was from an article. I actually did a previous video on this. The article is called 24 or So Orthodox Arguments Against Hyper-Preterism. Again, a hyper-preterist is somebody who has way too many of these drinks in a row, or has some Red Bulls and just like cannot contain themselves. I'm hyper. I always just get a kick out of that term. And the first video I called Everything But the Bible. Everything But the Bible, where I took a handful of these arguments against preterism, and essentially I tried to refute their refutation. And I'm going to continue a little bit in that same article with some different points here. And one of the reasons I'm doing this, I hope that that this teaching will help you to have more confidence in the beliefs you have. If you already consider yourself someone who believes in fulfilled eschatology, or preterism, or whatever, again, your favorite fulfilled pronouns are. That's the way I like to say it. Whatever you like to be called. If you're someone who believes this, I'm hoping this can help you. If you're someone that's not sure, you're sort of on the fence and looking into these things, I hope to help you as well. And by the way, those of you that are preterists, send this out to people that aren't preterists. I mean, I'm getting really encouraging comments, which is wonderful. But I would love to be engaging with people who think what I'm teaching is ridiculous or is not true in any way too, and to have some engagement with those folks. So send it out to some of them as well. But I'm also hoping with this channel to equip you as you talk to people to sort of think through how you might respond to some of the common critiques and pushbacks to preterism. So the one I'm going to start with here has to do with time statements, or sometimes called time texts, time indicators. But actually over 101 of those verses in the New Testament that give specific timing for the events of the eschaton, or the end times events, that sure seem to place it in the first century. So there's a lot of them. There's not just a handful, and that's a big thing that that we want to be using. But this author is basically being overly critical. His name again, Paul Manata. Paul Manata is the one who wrote this article, and he borrowed from some different articles and so on. But he's kind of giving preterists a hard time about the time statement. So I'm going to be looking here at some notes. I've just got my phone here, but I'll try to continue to focus on you. But he says one of the things that preterists say is we take the time text seriously. Yes and amen. He says, oh yeah? Well, then can you date 1 John more accurately than anyone else? And he gets a little snarky here. After all, we read, this is 1 John 2:18 and following, little children, it is the last hour. And as ye heard that Antichrist cometh, had to use the King James, didn't he? Even now have there arisen many Antichrists, whereby we know that it is the last hour. And then he says, so 1 John was written at 11 p.m. on December 31st, 69 AD? No. So we don't take the time text that seriously. Really? Really? Isn't part of, taking a genre of literature in a literal sense, taking it in the way in which the author intended it? Have you really ever heard anyone, even someone who's not a preterist, a dispensationalist, someone who holds to the a-mill view, post-mill, partial preterism, whatever, have you really ever heard anyone, before I just read that to you, insist that when John said it's the last hour, he was actually talking about 1 hour of a day on a clock? Really? So that's like out of hand. It's almost not even worth dealing with. And what's really fascinating, and John Noe did some really great work on this. I think he might have it in a couple books. The book I'm thinking of, I think, is called The Last Days Unraveled. The Last Days Unraveled. I think I'm sorry, I didn't make a note of this ahead of time. But he basically takes this idea of like a rocket launching T-12, and then he says as you go through the chronology of the New Testament letters, in other words, as they move further and further from the resurrection of Jesus, closer and closer to the destruction of the temple and so on in AD 70, that the imminence becomes more and more pronounced. And so some of the earlier writings might talk more generally about the last days or end times. You can tell it's there. You can tell it's on their mind. It's something they're looking forward to, that they know is coming, but it doesn't have quite a sense of urgency. And then as you move on, now it's getting more serious. You might think of Paul, Romans 8, our salvation is nearer than it was before. Romans 13, talking about the day is almost past, or the night is almost past, the day is here, and so on. Well, there's pretty good agreement that these three little letters by John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, were written pretty late in the game. And here John is saying it is the last hour. And again, no one, until I had read this article, I literally had never heard anyone insist, well, he's talking about 1 literal hour. So this is just a ridiculous argument. Clearly what's happening is there's movement from the end days, the last times, to get into this 1 hour, and John is saying, hey, we are really, really close. I mean, I think that's just obvious. And so that's why he has to get a little snarky about it, because he's just stretching credulity here to a breaking point. And then he gives a quote here by Don Preston, where Don Preston writes, is there anything wrong with these statements? If God cannot tell time, there isn't. But God can read a calendar, and if God truly meant to communicate with man, there is something drastically wrong. Essentially, what these time statements say is that while God said the kingdom was at hand, God cannot tell time, therefore the at-hand time statements mean nothing at all. And what Don is doing here is refuting people, because you always get this argument, well, time is much different for God, the time statements mean nothing, and yet God always communicates to us in a way we can understand. God can communicate. God can tell time. When the author of this article then again takes that to a ridiculous degree and says, well, apparently he can't, because it would have had to have been 11 p.m. on December 31st of AD 69, and it's just pretty silly. And then he goes on to Revelation 20, and let me just read verse 3 here from Revelation 20, and cast him into the abyss and shut it, and sealed it over him, that he should deceive the nations no more, until the 1,000 years should be finished. After this he must be loosed for a little time. So now what this author is saying is that, well, Preterists, on the one hand, you say these time texts are really important. John said the last hour. It's got to be a 60-minute period of time. Therefore, it isn't. Therefore, preterism isn't true. Oh, and then you get to Revelation 20. He's being a little snarky in his tone, so I'm just responding with the tone he's using. Oh, it says 1,000 years, but you say it's not a literal 1,000 years. There's another case in which you say, I take these time texts seriously, but you don't. Now, that would be a fair point. Again, unless we're not using good hermeneutics and looking at that particular context that we're in. And again, I shared from 1 John, it's really clear he's not making that a literal hour, but he's saying we're getting really, really close here. And we talk like that, even in our language now when things are getting closer, man, the hour's coming, or we talk about, we might look at an era of an athlete or something and say the time of that athlete. And we understand how we use those phrases. Well, in Revelation 20, if you look at the rest of the context, let me just read a couple verses. If this in fact is supposed to be a literal 1,000 years, I saw an angel coming down out of heaven, having the key to the abyss and a great chain in his hand. Is there a literal key? Is there really a great chain in this angel's hand? Literally. Verse 2, and he laid hold of the dragon, the old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. Are we talking about a literal dragon here? That this angel has a literal key around a literal chain? I don't know anyone that thinks that. I don't know any dispensationalists that think that. And so clearly in this context, you've got a lot of symbolism being used, and you've got that 1,000-year period of time used right in the midst of that symbolism. And you've got 1,000 used many other times in the scriptures in a way that's not saying literal 1,000. One that just came to mind would be, God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. And nobody thinks, no dispensationalist thinks, well, he doesn't own the cattle on 1,001 hills. He doesn't, So it's a number that's used symbolically, and it's used symbolically in Revelation 20. And again, even within dispensationalism, you might have some different ways that number is used. But certainly, within any of the other eschatologies, not just preterism, you have different ideas. Where from an amill perspective, we're in the millennium. Some would say more in a spiritual sense. Some would say more on the earth, but some would say it's a long period of time. Post-mill would stretch that out and say it's a lot longer than that. So the point is, there's only one eschatology that does see that as a literal 1,000 years, with possibly a couple exceptions. So you always have to look at the particular writing. Obviously, that's just good hermeneutics. And then even within a writing, like since he uses Revelation here, within Revelation even, some of it's apocalyptic, some of it isn't. So you have to know what you're reading. And so these particular arguments are hard to even take very, very seriously, to be honest. Well, then he goes on to Ezekiel 12. And again, I don't want to go too in depth with this. I'd encourage you to look on your own. But Ezekiel 12, essentially, there are some prophets, and there are some events that are to take place that apparently were to be soon, but a lot of the people weren't believing it. And God's actually really critical of that, and he's essentially saying, hey, when I'm saying through these prophets these things are going to happen soon, they're going to happen soon. Well, the author of this article believes that Ezekiel 12 was prophesying end-time events. And so he's saying, or actually, to be fair, I think he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Sorry. And he's saying that happened quite a long time from the time Ezekiel was written. And basically he's then making the case, well, if Ezekiel and the prophets there were saying these things were to happen soon, but they didn't happen for hundreds of years, clearly soon doesn't mean soon the way we would think of it. Again, a fair argument. The problem with that, and I checked several resources even doing this video just to make sure, is that a lot of the scholarship on this believes that the events being prophesied in Ezekiel 12 actually did happen very soon, and they had to do with the Babylonian exile, which was in about 586, 587 BC. These prophecies were occurring sometime between 593, 570 BC. So actually, the events being prophesied did happen soon in that Babylonian captivity, which was right around the corner. Further, I do believe that there are times when the Old Testament prophets were speaking of events and local judgments that were happening then, but there may also have been a further reaching context of the ultimate destruction of Jerusalem, because some of those earlier prophecies, whether they're in Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, various places, it talks about God divorcing Israel and later Judah, but some of the things in those prophecies do seem to talk about a final ending doom of Israel, Old Covenant Israel, which I believe happened in AD 70 in those events with the temple and so on. I do think it's fair that in those Old Testament prophets, we do have this sense of there was a soon coming judgment, but that it also was looking forward to something in the future. I think that's fair game, and that does happen. But once we get to Christ, that stops, because ultimately he is the ultimate fulfillment of all of this. So once we get to him, we can no longer say, well, some of the things that Jesus taught or the apostles taught, we're going to have immediate context, but they also had something in the far future. We just can't get there with using good hermeneutics, realizing like he's the apex, he's the thing towards which everything comes. And once we get to him, doesn't Hebrews 1 and 2 even say that in the past God spoke through prophets and so on, but in these last days he's speaking through his son, and there's nothing in the things that Jesus talked about that indicates that there's then a second happening of all these things. And so again, that's where I think this argument goes away. But again, this particular author is not even recognizing that any of that would have been prophesied for a soon coming judgment in the Babylonian exile, and he's kind of in a minority there with the scholarship. Well, let's just look at one more in this video. Now, by the way, I did a whole video on this, which I called "So You're in a Cult Now?" as a question. So you're in a cult now? You might want to check that out. But he talks about cult-like tendencies. That's another reason that hyper-preterism cannot stand. And he gives some scenarios from his own life where apparently he went to a Bible study one time with some preterists, and he talks about how they were all glassy-eyed and they had all been part of all these false religions and things, like just setting them up like they're just a bunch of just whack nuts, just wheat grain eaters. I said that in another video recently. I don't know where it even came from, but I thought it was funny. Said it again. I think that's what I said. At any rate, have I met some weird preterists, or am I aware of a handful? Sure. Have you ever met any weird Christians? Yeah. A few agnostics. Yeah. There's just some weird people on the planet, right? And apparently all of them were in this one study that he attended. And again, he's just kind of going out of his way to make it so obvious that these people are a bunch of weirdos, that they can't exegete scriptures, they know nothing about hermeneutics, they don't even know how the time statements work, they don't know what Ezekiel 12 says, all this stuff. And apparently all these people were in the same room at the same time. And of course, that's just not how it works. But he said that one of the main things about a cult is that the people who hold to it believe that everybody else is wrong on like everything throughout the history of that whole thing. So he's saying that hyper-preterists believe that the whole church has been wrong on everything for thousands of years. I don't believe that. I don't know any preterists that believe that. In fact, I've mentioned this before, but the whole idea that a lot of preterists want nothing to do with tradition, nothing to do with denomination, nothing to do with creeds, nothing to do with church history is just ludicrous. All of that is very, very helpful, and I appreciate it, and I read in all those areas, and I think a lot of people do. It's all very important. But the creeds themselves say that any time the creed would come up against something in Scripture, that Scripture trumps that creed, or Scripture trumps that denomination, or tradition. Of course it does. It's what's authoritative. It's what is inspired. Well, these other writings that may be very helpful, or these other ideas throughout the history of the church and so on, may not be. But he says that they're just cult-like, and I also, now I know preterists that are really strongly convicted about what they believe. I'm one of them. Do you know any dispensationalists that are strongly convicted about what they believe, and they believe that their view of eschatology is right and everybody else's is wrong? If you have a certain paradigm that you hold to that you believe is right, isn't everything else necessarily wrong? I mean, I'm sorry, can we just use some logic in these interactions? And there are, I'm sure, some good pushbacks to this, but this guy, I don't know. I wish I could sit down and have a cup of coffee with him and like talk through some of this stuff. I really do, because I just, anyway, I just don't know people like that just everybody else is wrong in the history of the church on all these things. Maybe they're out there somewhere. Maybe they're still sitting in this room where we went to the Bible study years ago because they only come out at dark or something. I don't know. But he uses the cult thing. Again, watch my video on that. I think you'll see some good things there. And we're going to leave it here for now. I'm going to come back and continue a little bit in this article, talk a little bit about the dating of Revelation, which certainly is very important. But again, I hope you liked this content. I hope it was helpful for you. I hope some of it even equipped you to talk to other people as you encounter these various pushbacks. Because, like I said in another video, you're just not going to be a preterist for very long before somebody is going to start sending you articles or videos and are telling you you're in a cult or you're a heretic or you're in a hairy cult or I don't know, eating wheat bread. I don't even know what that stuff means. But I do hope this was helpful to you. You know, like, share, subscribe. Again, if you were the 125th subscriber, you can either make a comment, tell me what you would like me to do a video on. You can PM me on Facebook or however you want to get a hold of me. Bros of Berea podcast. Check it out. Today, this is Thursday, the 27th of July. They're going to drop an episode with Dr. Amy Castillo. That's an amazing testimony. The testimony I did with them drops August 3rd, next Thursday. You might want to check that out and go through the other testimonies with some of the names I mentioned at the beginning of this video. Also, I was so privileged. I just want to give a shout out to my friend Pastor David Curtis. Sometimes the Bros of Berea, they have their studio in, I believe it's South Carolina, but sometimes they'll go to Berean Bible Church, which is, if you haven't watched some of their stuff, it's BreanBible.org. It might be BreanBibleChurch.org. And then they have a section at the top of the website called Studies, and you hit that, and you can go down in the last day's studies. I mean, there's all kinds of great content. But anyway, they took their podcast on the road, and they interviewed us there, so I also got to go and be part of that service a few weeks ago and meet some of those folks, and just fantastic. It was really a highlight of the year. So appreciate all of you and all your kind comments. Again, share this with people that won't agree with me, because it's important to have respectful dialogue and engagement there as well. But until then, Pastor Joel saying bye for now.